Bom dia. I'm sure that you all speak perfect Portuguese by now, after all the caipirinhas. And, well, this is the last panel of our meeting. Just to repeat the mantra, this is the second thematic meeting of the Monnet Network on Atlantic Studies. We had a very lively and very enlightening seminar yesterday, and we close, it's a golden closure, with this outstanding panel. I'm going to introduce my colleagues here, which is supposed to discuss the shape and form. It's a very pompous title, the shape and form of future trade agreements. Given that, as we know, first of all, the Atlantic area is famous for its love of integrations. So we find several regional integrations here. We find the European Union. The European Union is the sponsor of this project. The European Union is a kind, was more, but it still is a model integration. They like very much to spread their voice, to spread their experience on regional integrations. So this is a panel in which we are going to discuss. My colleagues here, they are all honorable and very serious men. So they had wonderful presentations, and unfortunately I said, look, this is a much humble attempt at informally discussing, drawing on their fantastic experience, drawing on their experience on the team, just to raise ideas, see what they think. Maybe they have examples from their own life. And then after about 1 hour and 10 minutes, you know that many people like the sound of one's voice. As a professor, I adore to hear myself. We'll try to pass the word to the floor, okay? So that you can interact, ask questions, and let us say the round table expands its reach to include you, okay? That's the idea. Let me introduce very briefly my colleagues here. At my right, we have Dr. Carlos Mariani Bittencourt, who is an outstanding Brazilian entrepreneur. I like also to say whenever I present Dr. Mariani Bittencourt, he's a gentleman. Sometimes he's a species which is disappearing, but Dr. Mariani Bittencourt is a true gentleman. He has a very diversified experience, either in business or in trade, because he has participated, he has headed, he has coordinated a series of groups, of business groups, groups of entrepreneurs in multiple trade negotiations affecting Brazil. So he has an enormous experience in the negotiations with the European Union. He was telling me that one of these groups has been revived, which is the Business Coalition. He has an enormous experience on Mercosur, on trade negotiations in general, on the WTO. So Dr. Mariani Bittencourt brings, together with his wisdom and his very balanced and reasonable view of things, brings an invaluable experience to this roundtable. I'm thankful to him, because I know that he's very busy. He was in Brazil yesterday, and he made the extraordinary favor to be here with us. So thank you very much, Dr. Mariani Bittencourt. We are very glad to have you here. Then, at the right of Dr. Mariani Bittencourt, we have Professor Dan Hamilton. Professor Dan Hamilton is the representative of another member of this network, which is the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, Washington, D.C. He has a vast experience on the Atlantic. Actually, he was the mastermind, one of the masterminds of a former European Commission project we had. And actually, he was the original mastermind of our project, which we, FGV, modestly accepted to coordinate, thanks to silly reasons that happen in life, bureaucracy. So there were bureaucratic issues with Johns Hopkins, and Dan asked us to coordinate. I hesitated, but in the name of friendship and the name of Atlantic Partnership, we accepted. We are very glad, and we are very glad that at least Johns Hopkins is still with us, is a member of the project. Professor Hamilton also has an enormous experience in Europe. He lived for a long time in Germany. He has just arrived from Germany yesterday, so we have to thank him also. I think he's in pretty good shape. He forgot the tie, but that's no problem. You know, Americans are more informal. Oh, God. That's it. So Professor Hamilton combines U.S. view with knowledge on Europe and his knowledge on the Atlantic in general and his concept on the Atlantic. Sometimes we may disagree on his geographic definition of the Atlantic, which is very optimistic. Of course, Americans, they always think big, but it's very interesting. He brings also a precious and valuable view to our round table. At my right, I have an old friend, so at my left, yes, but you refuse to be at my left, that's it. So I continue. I have two rights. So at my second right, you know, he's a liberal and he's very orthodox. So at my second right, I have an old friend, and as he is a very old friend, I don't need to praise him. Okay, so I won't say anything about him, but anyhow, you deserve a few words. It's Dr. Roberto Fendt. Dr. Roberto Fendt was the most successful president of the Foundation of International Trade in Brazil. He was more than a president. He was a kind of emperor, because you were there for what, 20 years, 30 years? 25. So since he's 15, when he was 15 years old, he started, and he stayed for 25 years there. So he has an outstanding experience on Brazilian international trade. Then he had several positions. He worked at FGV, but he found FGV very boring. And then he left us. Then he had interesting position at the think tank, which shared a panel yesterday with us at CEBRI. He was research and executive director of CEBRI, and now he was bought by the Chinese. He will deny this, but he works on a China-Brazil council, where he, of course, business council. Yeah, he's interested in business only nowadays, but so he combines this experience of the Brazilian trade policy, his knowledge on China, knowledge on regional integration, and I'm very grateful to have him here, because he was also yesterday in Brasilia and was supposed to stay in Brasilia today, I think for a big lunch. I didn't understand very well the motive, but anyhow, he came from Brasilia to share with us his wonderful knowledge and his wonderful sense of humor. Thank you very much, Roberto. Yeah, and at the extreme of my second left is also an old friend, so I feel more at ease to introduce him. And he has the gift, we share the same first name. So it's Professor Renato Baumann, and only for this he's an important man, of course. But Professor Renato Baumann, he has also an outstanding career. He has a PhD from Oxford University. He worked at the IPEA. I think he still is, let's not get into detail, but I think he's still associated to IPEA. Then he had a fantastic career at ECLAC. He was director of ECLAC, made an outstanding work at ECLAC, either in Chile, then afterwards here in Brazil. Then he came back to IPEA, where he was a very active and very courageous, because sometimes in these federal think tanks, you just sit down and don't do anything. Renato Baumann did a lot of things, director for international economics at IPEA, and now he came back to government, to the true government. He's Under-Secretary for International Affairs at the Ministry of Planning in Brasilia, where he, as usual, is performing an outstanding work and an outstanding duty. So I'm very glad. Professor Baumann also, he teaches. Our Foreign Office has a school for training diplomats. He's also a professor at the Foreign Office School, and he's also a professor at the Federal University of Brasilia. Given that he's a very serious husband and he has 5 grandchildren, I wonder how he finds time to do all these things. But apparently he does, and nobody's angry with him. On the contrary, everybody's very happy. Professor Baumann also made a fantastic effort. He woke up today at 5 o'clock. At 7:30 he was here at FGV because he thought that the roundtable was at 8 o'clock. So we are very grateful for your coming, and we are very, very happy. I'm sure that we are going to have an outstanding roundtable. So, to start, I'll make a kickoff, and I'll pass the word to my second right, as far as I understood. Yeah, we were just plotting what to do before you arrived. The point is the following. We have a new reality. This new reality was well discussed yesterday. We had João Cravinho, the EU ambassador here, made a wonderful presentation. But we have a new reality. The US administration, to the great chagrin of the Chinese, who are not yet number 1 in the world, and we know that the things that are made in Washington, so if Dan Hamilton sniffs, this has an impact all over the world. So the US administration closed or stopped. The Europeans say they are frozen. So let's use the European word. Froze the negotiations of the TTIP, refused to get into the TPP, and is pursuing. I don't think we're going to have a commercial trade war. I'm very optimistic. I have an interpretation of the US which nobody seems to agree, but I think it's correct. So he's pursuing a trade policy which is not unusual, by the way, but which goes not exactly opposite, but different from what had been done in the past, let us say, 10 to 15 years. We have new realities also in South America. We have new realities in Africa. In the beginning of this week, we had, I think, a very important event, which we discussed yesterday. Frank helped me to understand. 44 African countries manifested the will to make a free trade area, which in principle, as far as I understood, was signed by 21 countries, many of them in the Atlantic coast. This is an interesting development. Ambassador yesterday was very enthusiastic about the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, which is already 20 years old. I heard 22. I heard that next year. That's it. That's what I was telling the ambassador. I heard that next year it's going to get married with another agreement. I don't know. But anyhow, he's very enthusiastic. He thinks that it's going to be fixed until the end of April. So that's interesting. So we have a lot of new realities. So my first question to my friends in the round table is that we came from an era of this kind of encompassing trade agreements. TTIP was very ambitious, all kinds of regulations. TPP also, standards, rules. And now we came back to the good old times to a certain extent, in my view. So I would like to ask my friends here, do you think that these big encompassing trade agreements, particularly in the Atlantic realm, are over? What do you think is going to be the prospects of a comeback of this kind of trade agreements?
Thank you, Renato. You are very kind in our presentations. I appreciate it. I was wondering here, we're all friends, but then is not as old a friend as the others. And then I noticed you are from Johns Hopkins University. I have a very good friend there. I'm not sure he is still there. Riordan Roet. He's still there. So in a sense, you belong to the number of friends in this panel. Well, I'll take the initial words of Renato. Renato said that I didn't prepare anything. I spent 2 months preparing this presentation, and it's all in here. So by professional deformity, I'll start our discussion with the background, if you don't mind. How many hours do we have? It's a very broad. But those very few who remain will profit from my observations. But anyway, what is going on essentially? Mr. Trump had been in office for almost a year and a half, almost. Nothing had happened on the trade front. There were many remarks by Mr. Trump about the Chinese. They are not very kind all the time, but the remarks were about the Mexicans and the Canadians were not better than the remarks about China. What is new in this context? I guess the Americans have a very curious perception of the world economy. The system the Americans created back in 1944-47, these rules-based multilateral trading and many other areas, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, they produced 70 years of uninterrupted growth. Americans were the ones who profited more from this rules-based system. Well, people look at Mr. Trump and have a very emotional response to the way Mr. Trump presents himself to the public. Those very kind to him say he's a buffoon, but some people say he's kind of a Mussolini in new clothes. I guess this is not strictly correct. He seems to be all these things, and sometimes he is. But he has a master plan in his mind. There's something behind his mind. And this something is the opposite of the previous system. The previous system, multilateral, just to stick with trade, the multilateral trading system was a system of cooperation. It wasn't all-encompassing. The rules were for everybody, big and small nations. Whoever would comply with the rules would be a member to this system, and the world as a whole profited from it. Now we are entering an age of rivalry. The Americans are particularly scared about the prospects for national security of the rise of China as a major power. It's not the first time that an incumbent power feels unsafe by the emergence of a new one. The most clear example of this is the First World War. Nobody wanted a war, but events led to the most, up to that time, the worst war ever experienced. So this rivalry has a lot to do with, in part, with the ambitions of China to be a major power. China was the major power of the world until 1820, from the early beginning. So for most of the 18 centuries up to 1820, China was the biggest power. It's understandable that China would like to be a major power these days. The Americans are scared on the military side. And the administration of Mr. Trump used to have four basic pillars. The first was the president himself. Difficult to understand, difficult to predict what he's going to do because he's completely erratic. It's his style. The second was the faction of the trade falcons, hawks, who believe, they are firmly convinced that the United States is losing from the current multilateral system. They would rather prefer that the United States would negotiate 2 by 2, would negotiate with everybody on a 2 by 2 basis, which is great because the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. Whoever would negotiate with the United States, no rules, this would be great. Unfortunately, this is not well perceived and accepted by potential trading partners. The second faction is the faction of the national security hawks. These folks believe that China will assert a cyber war against the United States. There are several examples of the reaction to these, to what they perceive as a menace to the supremacy of the hegemony of the United States in the world. Chinese students are now very, very monitored in what they do, where they go, with whom they speak. The United States is avoiding the acquisition of Chinese or of high-tech firms in the States, American firms. In this particular, they share the same worry with Germany, so they're together. They're together with these folks. And there was, in the past, a fourth line of reasoning in the White House, which was the people who were globalists. They accepted that globalization was good for the United States because it had been good for the United States for several decades. Unfortunately, the head of this group was fired, is no longer in the White House. So now we have American policies directed by the president himself, the falcons of the trade policy and the falcons of national security. Well, the biggest nation in the Atlantic is the United States. They are becoming isolationists. They want to get out of many of the treaties. By the way, I don't share the worries of many people about the transatlantic partnership. The United States has free trade agreements with all these folks, so it doesn't matter really if the United States is in or is out. It was great because it was an attempt to, on a diplomatic sphere, political sphere, to say that the United States were barring China from expanding in the Pacific, but it doesn't matter really. I guess it's more worrisome. This recent 25% raise in the tariff on iron and steel products, because Canada is the major supplier of steel products to the United States. It's not China. China is a small supplier to the United States. So, what can we say about it? I really don't know what is the future. And they made all these initial provocation because I'm sure people will not agree with most of what I said. But I'm not sure what is the real future of whatever the trade agreements in the Atlantic or whatever, if the United States is reluctant to be in. The United States must be in because the United States is still the largest economy, is the largest military country in the world. Without the United States, it will be difficult to have trade agreements which are meaningful. Honduras may have a trade agreement with Costa Rica, but that changes very little the overall picture. So, with these first words, I don't believe anybody will say that I'm an optimistic on this theme, but I guess I should stop. I don't know how much I spoke, but I guess it is within too much. This is a vice. There's nothing I can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I was afraid that you wouldn't answer my question, but eventually you made it. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you. So that's one view. I want to pass the word to Carlos Mariani Bittencourt, but I only ask Dam, given that you speak from Washington, Berlin, and Rio, would you like to comment, to make a short comment maybe before?
Thank you, Renato, and thank you for hosting us here as part of our network. It's good to see everyone. Let me, because of the spirit of the dialogue, I also prepared 2 hours talk, but I condensed it. So, but I won't refer to it. Let me just because of the spirit of the dialogue, come back to a couple of points. I would caution, in looking at the United States today, to say the Americans. We are having a huge political fight in the United States, in which each of our 2 major parties is, frankly, having a civil war with itself. The traditional notion of Democrats, Republicans is becoming quite fluid. It's hard to say what it even means anymore. You have many Republicans opposing the president. You have many Democrats fighting over the legacy of the Clinton debacle. And it's very unclear where things will go. But it is also clear that there are many opposing forces to what the president is trying to do, particularly in the Congress, including on trade. So when it comes down to really final decisions, it's not only the president who's erratic, but you don't know where the Congress will come out. And on some particular issues, they have blocked the president, Republican-led Congress blocking the president in a number of areas where they simply don't agree with him. They have so far been more about Russia and Ukraine and about military issues, but there's also a big push against what he's trying to do on trade. Whether it comes out, I can't tell you. There's also a different kind of force, which you see through the NAFTA renegotiations, that U.S. governors, the leaders of our 50 states, are all heading to Washington to argue why what Trump is doing is a disaster for their states. And the governors, in a big continental-sized country with a federal republic in which the governors really do play a big role, this is important to keep in mind. So it's fluid. One should not anticipate that everything the president tweets is becoming U.S. policy, because it actually isn't most of the time. It's a constant fight in Washington every day among all of these forces. So I just say that. That's why it's unpredictable, as you said. We don't really know, but actually the president himself doesn't know. He doesn't not have a master plan. No master plan. Go day by day. He is a transactional businessman who is using transactional business tactics to leverage a U.S. position vis-a-vis other partners. Allies, adversaries, it's all kind of conditional, depending on the advantage you can gain, in his view, for the United States. So I think with that as a setting, back to your question, what we're seeing, I think, is a different and often contradictory trends going on at the same time. You have the whole multilateral system in crisis at the WTO. For reasons that much of which have to do with the WTO. And I think in general sense it has not been producing, because we're not getting any consensus or any breakthroughs in the WTO itself before Trump on a whole host of really important trade issues. So it's not been functioning. What Trump has done is to question the premise of it and to try to block, particularly in the appellate body that's important to these trade contestations, if you will, any way to move forward. Because, as you had said, this concern, not a fear, I don't think the word fear appears in the American perceptions about China, a concern that China's system of what one would say is a predatory, mercantilist type of approach it enables them to game the system in ways that those committed to multilateralism just aren't prepared for. And there is a debate, not just in the United States, how wise it was at the time to admit China into the WTO. And there's I think in many countries now, a kind of rethinking about why was that done at that time, what were the premises behind it, and should that be reconsidered. But the result is that, as you had said, the country that sort of helped create this liberal international order is questioning it in some very important ways. It's not trying to, I think, destroy it, but it wants different terms. And so that's at one level. And then Renato's question is, at the next level, what I would call supercharged bilateralism. That's what I think we're seeing these days. You see the U.S. renegotiating a number of its agreements, pulling out of some, pulling out of plurilateral or mega-regional ones that Obama won in favor of really tough bilateral. But you see the EU is doing the same thing. I mean, the EU is probably even acting more as a bilateral trade now than the United States, with a whole host of renegotiations or new negotiations, and in a way is trying to encircle the United States with its own web of agreements. So you see that, and then you see this sort of the hanging on of the mega-regional agenda that had existed, that you mentioned. You have the EU here trying to create this new deal. That's a mega-regional deal, really. It's not just a bilateral. You have the revival of the TPP without the United States. You have the African agreement. So you do see the mega-regional agenda also moving forward, but not in an even way. When you have Nigeria saying it's not going to participate in the African agreement, that's also a big issue for the Africans to actually achieve much. So that agenda is kind of lurching forward, but difficult. And then I would say what we're finding are these other deeper trends that are influencing trade and perceptions of it. One is the digital world. The digital economy in many ways is becoming the economy. Yet we don't have any good data about data. Governments don't really know how to measure these flows or these interactions in good ways. And so we don't really know the extent to which we are becoming dependent on these digital connections, and yet we know we are. So we have to think harder about the digital world, how it's interacting with sort of the traditional trade world. And there are a number of measurements. I did a study last year in which we come up with 5 metrics of how we actually could think about that. I won't get into it. But just say that's a driving force right now, and we don't have good rules about it. It interferes with privacy issues, with protectionist issues, with fears of competition, a whole range of them. The second is, I think, changes in technology that are affecting how trade is conducted, that it's broken up in terms of trade and tasks. And new kinds of technology allow you, like additive manufacturing, to bring things back home. You don't necessarily have to have the extended flows across the globe. And so those are being changed and disrupted. And I just mentioned that as I think it's changing the notion of trade. And the third is energy. There's a whole new paradigm of energy, which many of us have been involved in. Our last book was all about that. And that's particularly important to the Atlantic, because of the nature of the changes of energy. Many of them are rooted actually in the Atlantic basin. And I think that will affect how we think about trade in the future. So I think above the below the politics, high politics, and actually the traditional trade agenda, there are these deeper forces that are carving out new currents that will affect how the Atlantic participates in the global trading system.
Thank you very much, Dom. I see that you all made much more homework than I expected. And please, I have the pleasure now to pass the word to Dr. Mariani.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I haven't had possibility of developing anything, something say, comparable. Yeah, for sure. I was in Brasilia for 2 weeks, and when you're in Brasilia, you don't have any opportunity of going out of those circles. But yesterday, the day before yesterday, I finally invited my fellow traditional at the National Confederation of Industry, and because all these negotiations for industries with EU and here at Mercosur are conducted by the National Confederation of Industry. Since 22 years ago, I am the director at the National Confederation of Industry. I witnessed this first years of the negotiations inside South America, inside the four members of Mercosur, and then finally when we received a visit here of a very important German businessman that suggested in 1997, that we should look together 4 or 5 countries in Brazil and 4 or 5 in EU. At that time, we were not thinking in 27. Yeah? And we started this. It was not very easy, but was very comfortable also to negotiate, not negotiate, to suggest and receive response to this suggestion. And this took about, I don't know how many years. Yes, maybe let me make the calculation here. And in the 1999, and then in 2000, and the first meetings were in early 2000. And the negotiations were proceeding very well, was very friendly, with very qualified people from both sides. That was important. I don't include myself in the qualified people, but I had a very strong support by people in Mercosur, especially Brazil and Argentina. The contribution of Uruguay and Paraguay at that time and today is not that valued. But we started this, and meetings in both sides of the Atlantic for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And finally, we reached in Lisbon the date of the possible signature of a preliminary document that would be the stone, the fundamental stone. Yeah. And we had that meeting in Lisbon, and for our surprise, the South American team, early in a few hours before, the Europeans changed that, and there was a always as usual. Agriculture did not accept what's being discussed by industry. So this was something that we could not face, and so in 1974 the negotiations were cut, and officially cut, and this was we talk about the recuperation of the negotiation was in 2010. So it was 6 years just doing nothing. And from 2010 there was a meeting in Madrid with the presence of most of the presidents of the European countries and the South Americans. Was really something that we could not think of made at that time. And everything started again. 2010, 11, 12, and finally we entered in something that was possible 3 years ago. And in these 3 years, there's almost every quarter we have meetings with both sides, a lot of information coming back and forth, and 27 countries in the EU. But the situation today is that we haven't in Brazil and in Mercosur, it's clear that we would like to have this negotiation and finalized. But the Europeans always use the problem that today is not possible because there's a new president that's being elected in the country, and he's not going to accept this. And finally, the 31st of December of this year was, last year, was considered and confirmed as the date of the signature. The president of EU was in Brasilia in early December with a lot of people, but no signature. No, let's wait. Yesterday in Buenos Aires, the deal was officialized there. So start everything again. And so what I did after your suggestion that you are going to offer us some bullets, I met with my young people in CNI, Confederation of Industry, said, let's take a look at this. This was yesterday morning. and let's try to write something intelligent to avoid just blah, blah, blah. That most of the meeting was blah, blah, blah. So, for instance, one question you put. What influence do the President of the United States trade policy can have within the Atlantic space nowadays? Everybody already think, but just very, very rapidly. There are clearly two main trends today, going in different directions. The Atlantic, when we talk about leaders in the region, United States and the European Union. The United States abandoned Obama's policy to deepen free trade agreements, especially through plurilateral approach, the TPP, where rules were much more developed there when the 12 countries and the disciplines like for state-owned enterprise were designed to isolate China. China always in the... So there was a strategy. The TPP could be seen as a new WTO. Today, U.S. policy of America First is only looking at goods, have a very mercantilist view, and in theory seeking bilateral free trade instead of plurilateral. However, except for Mexico and Canada, that have no choice, no other countries want to negotiate and renegotiate it with the U.S. U.S. policy is actually influencing a lot of European Union to maintain its trail on free trade agreements. The second question, is there room for European Union to advance the more aggressive trade policy in the Atlantic space? There's a lot of room for the European Union, and the Europeans are taking advantage of it. Firstly, EU is maintaining its free trade policy. It has finished the agreement with Canada that took a lot to be internalized, and recently celebrated an agreement with Japan. So the EU is celebrating relevant new agreements and updating old ones. In the case of Japan, I am following very closely because we have a very close relationship between the National Confederation of Industry in Brazil with Kendanen in Japan. So we know every semester we meet here. The next April 4th, we have a meeting with most of the leaders of the industry in Japan. The most important one, firstly, Europe is maintaining its free trade policies. Has finished this is already read yet. The most important one that the European Union is negotiating is with Mercosur. The bloc is the largest market, and an agreement that the European Union will have to be more flexible in agriculture. For Mercosur to be very pragmatic, with new rules and more trade liberalization. Also, the European Union renegotiated with Chile and is renegotiating the free trade agreement with Mexico. So, the EU is taking advantage of this moment by negotiating new trade agreements with a deeper compromise like sustainable development, but it's still not as deep of TPP led by the United States during the Obama administration. The next question is, what's the evaluation on the likelihood of fixing, reshaping new agreements? Then we discuss this.
Because I want thank you very much. We come back to this wonderful homework. And I just want to highlight a few points. You remember yesterday Ambassador Carneiro Leão, what he said about China and the WTO, that China loved the WTO. And you've heard what Professor Hamilton said today. So you see that things start to match and we start to make up for a picture which is interesting. Also, Professor Hamilton raised new points, which is the digital world. The retreat of fragmentation, which is something very interesting, that maybe, given that we're going to stay here for 8 hours, we'll be able to discuss. It's a very interesting point with deep consequences, and this opens a way to make someone who hasn't worked until now, which is to pass the word to my dear friend, Professor Baumann, to hear his views on the original question, because Roberto's answer was very superficial, as you saw, and to complement what has been said. And also, I would like to add, given that you're too clever, another question which is related to the first one, because one important point in these agreements was the discussion of standards and rules. So let us suppose that we are not going to have any more this encompassing, though Dams said that Europe is trying to negotiate encompassing agreements, and to a certain extent TPP is trying to preserve, to keep the encompassing character, which I think without the US the game is different, so I don't know. But so I would add to you, do you think that even if we don't have more those mega agreements, the issue of standards and rules is here to stay, will even be present in more modest agreements? So I would make this compliment, and please.
With friends like this, you don't need anything else. So, let me go back to the two questions now. And let me start by saying that I will focus on the Atlantic area as such, not the broad Atlantic area that comprise Indian countries and African countries in the Indian Ocean, those that are at the Atlantic coast. When you see the Atlantic, the southern part, us in Africa, is of course very poor. There's few things going on in terms of trade and investment, be it in absolute terms or even less in relative terms. It's not the most brilliant part of the world. Most of it takes part in the northern hemisphere, the US and European Union. And the only question is, are we bound to see further agreements for further negotiations? And I think the answer is definitely yes. In NAFTA, at the NAFTA level, two things that Trump brought to the table. Trump brought a number of things, but at least two of them are very important and updated, which is the very waiver of the steel and aluminum tariffs. If you behave yourself, we will negotiate and we'll treat you differently. We Brazil and Australia are now, and Korea, South Korea, have also jumped into that same wagon. But originally it was for Mexico and Canada. But then you have the second thing, which is the corporate tax rate adopted by the US, which is damaging a number of other countries. So NAFTA negotiations, yes or yes, some negotiation has to take place. Having said that, on the EU side, don't forget we have the perspective of Brexit. And why is Brexit relevant in these terms? Because about almost half of the value of US exports into the European Union gets via the UK. So if the UK leaves the European Union, as is predictable and is what we are seeing right now, that imposes two things. The very need of bilateral negotiation US-UK, by definition, almost. But then the market value of the EU for the US comes down because it loses a very important partner. And hence, there is bound to be new negotiations US and EU and European Union for the lack of UK. So there is a very likely scenario that, yes, we are bound to see something. And then you have the 5-year-old Canadian agreement with the European Union that has already been mentioned. It's Canada with the European Union. Canada is a member of the Commonwealth. If there is a Brexit, I don't know how these things will turn out, but yes, there is bound to be some new negotiations involving those countries. We, of course, there is a very strong hope, not only from the EU ambassador, but also I can assure you from the Brazilian government that yes, we are bound to finally have some agreement by late April, early May. And I presume there is concrete margin for that hope. So we are bound to see something very important for both of the two regions. Having said that, from the viewpoint of us developing economies in the Atlantic area, however you define that, there are three elements that we have to take into account. TTIP-1. Countries have signed that. And TTIP-1 is not as ambitious as it originally with the US, but it's there. TTP. Yeah, TTP-1, sorry. TPP-1. I'm sorry. And why is that relevant? Because it gives a very strong signal of from now on, negotiations have to take into account, it provides a bottom line for further negotiations comprising those countries. That's one point. Second point is China. Why China? Because China, of course, the turning point of the presence of China is 2001. China is overwhelming, the figures are so important, but we tend to forget that this is a very recent thing. Of course, you have since the 16th century, the Silk Road, but that was trade. The silk that came from China to the Philippines to America. That was only trade. What is new? Is the increasing intensity of trade of China with emerging economies or medium income level countries. If you plot a chart, the relative weight of low and medium income countries in China exports is something like this. It comes flat, in 2001 it goes like this. And the unprecedented thing is investment. The China flexing its muscles and increasing its presence everywhere, including in our economies. Now, why is that relevant? Well, of course, it is relevant in itself, but there is another aspect with regard to trade, preferential trade negotiations. The very fact that the first preferential trade agreements by China date from 2004. China has some 12 or 15 trade agreements so far. And the point is, as different from the US and the European Union, where you have one size fits all, this is the conditions: joining or lose it. If you agree, come in or else. In the case of China, it's tailor-made. Every single agreement takes into account the very interests of its trading partner. And this opens up a very wide door and very big door to the possibility of reducing resistance with regard to negotiating with China, because they seem to be so clever and so subtle that they take into account all things that you care most. That's the second point. The third aspect I want to emphasize is that most of the rich or the wealth on trade for the US and for the Europeans, it's not merchandise, it's service. That's where the real thing is. And if it is so, then because the trade in service, it's not something that you raise or lower tariffs in the frontier. Trading service, almost by definition, implies change in your domestic legislation, norms and practices. Hence, the agreements from now on are bound, A, to take place, that's what I have said, and B, to comprise government procurement, trading services, norms, the relation between government and private agents, and so on, you name it. Hence, I think the answer for the two questions is yes and yes.
Thank you very much. Renato's a very clever people. Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting answer. And you opened another area of investigation and discussion, which is the area of services. And that's interesting, this view. I like it very much, of TPP -1 and the need, the consequence of Brexit. It's very interesting what you said. And well, we were discussing this yesterday during dinner. It seems that the British didn't do, contrary to here, their homework on Brexit. So it's amazing that they didn't think about this, for instance, and the Europeans also. So that's very interesting point. Thank you very much. And given that we've been, the EU-Mercosur agreement has been airing, Dr. Mariani is a witness to the first negotiations. Me too. I worked for 10 years, since 97 until 2005. No, together. We worked together. We were in meetings in Brussels, lots of meetings in Brussels, in Paris, and all that. I would come back to Dr. Mariani, because you were going to say exactly about the likelihood of EU-Mercosur and NAFTA. You want to complement? Or I pass to Dan? I don't know. What do you prefer? Just feel free. What are the likelihoods? You said that you are optimistic.
No, I have been optimistic for years and years. No, not 20, but because I have 16 and then optimistic for 4 years. But it's something that we don't understand very clearly. Not only we from the private sector, but the relations, the negotiations with Mercosur and the Union is under the leadership of Brazilian Foreign Office. Ambassador Ronaldo Costa. Ronaldo Costa Filho is the negotiator. Ronaldo is very, very, very cautious in terms of all the information he gives, and at the end of the day you say Ronaldo, and then I say no, we are reaching we understand that they have problems, and so we cannot make try to force this, and maybe the next meeting, and next, as I mentioned, next we reach today, and what we're going to do. We'll have the diplomats say, patience, 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 but there's a limit for the patience. And is anybody prepared to offer an alternative to this patience? Nobody answers. That's the big problem.
Yeah.
One minute. I would like to ask Roberto, given your expertise in China, China has been mentioned several times. Would you like to say something, because we are going to change a bit the subject? Would you like to add something on China, given what Renato said, what has been said, or you're comfortable?
I'm always prepared to say something about China. There is a very big difficulty here and elsewhere on China's intentions. Well, the first thing to mention, I guess, would complement what Renato said. China is not rules-based. In a sense, the United States is going in the same direction, but China has never been rules-based. And then there's this point that Dan mentioned. When China joined the WTO, there was a big expectation in the West that this rapidly rising middle class in China would put pressure for democratization in the Western view. Is different from the Chinese view. The Chinese do not value conflict, several parties. They value harmony. That's why they have one single party. and they are not rules-based. This new Silk Road project is the way, as seen from China, of integrating China in the world economy. It's completely different from the model the United States created in the late 40s, 1940s. So it's not a system of rules. It's a system based on transportation, which will develop the western part of China, and then will take China worldwide, either by sea or by land, in the direction of Europe. So it's a different model. This should be clearly understood. And then Renato said something which is very, very important, which is very different from the American, until recently, way of writing treaties and negotiating all sorts of things. China is very flexible. Maybe in the future, when China is number one, this will change. But currently, they have agreements with everybody. Is in not just those small countries. They have a free trade agreement with Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. So it's different, and this should be kept in mind. They will continue expanding this Silk Road project. This is a political project, which will help some construction companies of China, of course. But this is not the main drive. The main drive is the insertion, is the competitive insertion of China in the world economy, in the words of Deng Xiaoping. But this is the point I would like to make.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Very interesting. Well, I'll pass to Dan, but irrespective of whatever you want to add, which is of course most welcome, I would like to add a further question. You mentioned a flurry of agreements in the Atlantic area. You also mentioned the question of Africa, Nigeria, though as far as I understood, Nigeria said that we'll join later. The reason unknown. I agree with you. I asked it about South Africa yesterday. Maybe they will join also in the future, I don't know. But the question I would like to go further than is, how do you see, with this, let us say, certain confusion, in spite of the clever points by Renato Baumann, how do you see an increase in South-South agreements in the Atlantic? You started with very negative views on the Southern Atlantic. So, and you keep your word on that. So, does this imply that nothing is going to happen? Or maybe I asked Frank yesterday about Mercosur and SADC, and he said, well, provided that automotive and agriculture is out, well, just even worse than the European Union. So, but maybe Dan, who's creative, has a different view. So Dan, please, your compliments, and if you could say something.
I will do that, but it's reflective of a different point which was mentioned, so I come to that. Okay. Let me just make a couple basic points. I think the point about services is really very important, especially that's where the jobs are. In the end, what we're talking about are jobs and growth. Trade is just a means. It's not the goal. And I think we've lost track of that in all of our narratives, as if trade is actually our goal. Maybe, maybe not. The goal, I think, for domestic leaders and publics is, do I have a job? And will I have a job in the future? And how does trade relate to that? And the second is, our economy growing because of this or not? And I think the narrative with the mega regional agenda got that all mixed up. And public started to think trade negotiators going to trade off, domestically determined standards because they wanted better market access. That wasn't what was happening, but that became the narrative, and that's why that all kind of started to collapse. So one has to think about services, and that takes you into the agenda beyond trade, and it is about standards and norms and deep intrusion into domestic ways of doing things. And that was put to its limits in the TTIP negotiations, because these were economies that were very similar, and yet that's where it really hit a wall. So we can come back to that, but I think one has to derive some lessons from that. The second point is that we talk about trade, but again, trade is not the driver of at least the North Atlantic economy, and I don't believe actually it's the driver with the South American, North American, or South American, European economies. It's investment. The reason why the German businessmen came to you in the 90s is because Sao Paulo is the largest center of German investment in the world. But the German political class doesn't know that. There's a big gap between the German political class and the German business community, which is why sometimes there's a problem. Investment is absolutely the driver of jobs and growth across much of the Atlantic. Trade follows it. It doesn't lead it. It's the reverse of economics 101. And when we talk about Brexit, for instance, it's not U.S. trade with the UK that's important. Actually, U.S. trade with the EU is much more, the remaining EU is much more important than the UK, and vice versa. But U.S. companies based in the UK export as much to the rest of the EU as U.S. economies based in China export to the rest of the world. And it's because of the deep, deep linkages of investment that are the things that create the jobs again. So you have about over 2 million people directly impacted just in the U.S.-UK relationship because of investment alone. Their jobs are tied up into that. It's a huge relationship. And the same in terms of European investment in the United States. It's all really what matters, not the trade. So one has to just keep these underlying factors in mind when we think about trade agreements. whether they really make a difference or not to these underlying fundamentals. What you want to make sure is you don't do anything that stops the investment flows, because that's actually the lifeblood of the economy. So we enter into this next difficulty, which you saw again in the TTIP, but also in Canada, and it comes to the EU role here, that the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, the traditional approach that you have to have some mechanism by which investor rights are protected vis-a-vis the state, is coming undone. There's no more consensus for that, and within the EU there's actually legal decision that says you have to push that out. That's more a competence of member states than the Commission. I think in the United States, the Trump administration, interestingly, also opposes ISDS. That's why I caution against saying the Americans, because they take some positions on trade. They're just not traditional approaches. The business community opposes it, opposes the Trump administration. So I think one has to think about a new model in terms of what we should think about. A couple, and I'll come to that in a second. The other point about the EU that I think is important to understand is I think the coming battles will be about the digital world and about privacy and about all these things. Because the EU approach basically is that privacy rights are human rights. They're not something you trade away in a deal. It is a fundamental approach. And so any trade partner that negotiates now with the EU has to certify, or the EU has to certify, that that trade partner has equivalent protections for privacy that the EU itself could accept. That's a very high standard if you think about what the EU is doing. And even on the Japan deal, it's not done because there's no adequacy determination yet with Japan on this issue. They have to finalize that before there will be a deal with Japan. And the same will be with every other bilateral deal, which makes it hard for the EU to be a multilateral partner, frankly, because they have to have every bilateral deal done on the privacy issue. And so that's why the EU is turning more into a bilateral negotiator than a plurilateral one, because of its own internal conditions. And I think that's going to be a future realm that we have to understand much better. The third point on the EU dimension here is what you had mentioned about Brexit, because that does affect a lot of what it is. It's really important to understand, at least from a U.S. perspective, back to my point about investment and changing nature of trade, that the value chain map of Europe is not the same for American companies as the institutional map of Europe. And it's becoming less the same. So the role of the UK, the role of Turkey, the role of Norway, the role of Switzerland, which is actually incredibly tied into the U.S. economy, are all becoming more important. So non-EU Europe is becoming much more important to the United States relative to the EU than it had been. The EU is still very dominant, but any type of new kinds of agreements have to encompass the broader European value chains and not just the EU qua EU. So I come back to my final point, at least to your question, Renato, which is I think of the different paths forward. The deep freeze that you mentioned for TTIP is the road to nowhere. In fact, it's the road to trade wars. So both sides have agreed that obstacles are far too high at the moment, incentives really low to do anything except freeze things. And you see what we're getting. Without any framework across the North Atlantic, it's a mess, and it's going to get worse. And the digital stuff is going to be the first big casualty of that. Whereas the U.S. has a framework with NAFTA and has with South Korea. And because of that, the Trump administration argued, well, we have these frameworks, so let's consider maybe some exceptions for those partners. The EU had to scramble to sort of say, oh, what about us too? Finally made it, but there's no mechanism in which we can mediate these disputes. It's all ad hoc. It's the daily chaos in Washington that Brussels is keep responding to. So I think this only ends up in a bad, bad place. One option is you revive what's called the Transatlantic Economic Council. It was created by the Bush administration, but it was a European idea. It's about cherry-picking agreements. It's not about a big deal. It's about very small deals, some of which are not trade, but back to the regulations. You let the bureaucrats do their job. and you get out of the high politics of things. That's going to be better than the DPRIs, but it didn't go well, if one recalls what happened with the Bush administration. It turned into how you clean a chicken, and that was the end of it. So it's a little better than a trade war, better than the DPRIs, but it's not much. The idea of a revival of TTIP, a TTIP 2.0 that maybe takes account of this, I think is distant at the moment, but one should not ever exclude it from one's thinking, but I'll leave that. But I come to my point, which is jobs and growth. The group that recommended the TTIP was actually called the High-Level Working Group on Jobs and Growth. If you talk to people, as I said, they're worried about their job. They're worried about what is all these forces doing. Am I going to have a job? What about, am I going to lose it? What's the reason I lose it? I think speaking to that agenda rather than, and using trade as an instrument but not as the goal, would be a far better approach in today's climate. So maybe you don't have trade agreements. You focus on other things that start to unite you. One, at least across the North Atlantic, is about education and the economy, and how workers can be trained, retrained by companies, and that the education system matches that. The whole notion of vocational training is actually very popular in the United States, drawing on European lessons. Even the Trump administration likes this. There's a big agenda there that could be good. A second is to split out the investor-state thing from trade and deal with it on its own as to make sure investment flows, but on the terms we could agree with. The third, which was one of the original motivations for TTIP, was what about third countries? Can they be part of these things, or are they excluded? Again, the impression that was left by the US and the EU, because they didn't accept the premise that TTIP would be open to others, was people thought this was a closed shop. So you also had opposition not only from within but from outside. And it was about high standards, maintaining high standards for people, and that those standards should be the goal, not to let those standards erode. And that's the point about China. Either we are going to work together to maintain the standards we believe in, or those standards will start to be eroded by countries that do not share those same views. It's not an anti-China coalition, but it is assertive about one's own social preferences and the standards by which people should live in this economy. That could be a very good part of what I would call job and growth agreements, not trade agreements, job and growth agreements, a JAGA. Something different. It can be bilateral. It can be agreement between two sovereign countries agreeing on a transaction. I'm speaking in Trumpese here, that they would understand. That's not all about the trade agenda. I think that would have some resonance, at least in the United States. I think it actually would have some resonance within parts of Europe. It helps us deal with the Brexit and big European value chain issues. And perhaps it's a way for us to engage with Southern partners in a different way, because the trade agreement process is so difficult. And then now this question, my final answer is, I think that's worth exploring across the Atlantic South. Instead of thinking about institutional big trade agreements between blocs in the South, which sounds difficult to me, why not think about the areas in which actually both sides could profit, even if it's not about trade? Brazil invests considerably in Africa, in lots of areas in which there's Brazilian expertise, there's African receptivity because of that. Why not expand more of that agenda and find a number of other complementary areas to promote commerce, including investment? And go down simply, just think differently, I think might open up some new avenues that we haven't really explored like we could.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very interesting points. Well, it is more than 11:30, so I would ask my friends here if they want to add something, because I would like to pass the word to the floor. Would you like to say something else, or can we open to questions? Please. Just 1 hour.
Just a footnote why I'm skeptical with regard to the southern part of the Atlantic. Fully agree, there's lots of Brazilian in particular initiatives in Africa, to the point that there is a feeling that we are losing ground to the Chinese. This should be our natural counterpart. But the point is, there is no other continent in the world with so many trade agreements as Africa. And yet, the percentage of interregional trade is less than 2-digit%. So I'm skeptical about the initiative of the 40 plus African countries, and the traditional formal way of making agreements. I fully agree with you. Specific initiatives are far, in this case in particular, is far more bound to provide actual results than formal agreements.
It's, I couldn't agree more with you, Renato. I lived 2 years in Africa, and things deteriorated very much since I left Africa. The Sahel region, maybe you're right. But anyway, I came back in 2012, and the Sahel region is getting worse and worse. You cannot have trade, big trade between the African countries irrespective of trade agreements. It doesn't matter. Simply because the economies are too much equal to each other. And then you have the communications, transportation, and communications problems. So it's, I'm very skeptical. People look at the rates of growth of the African countries as the area of the world which is growing faster. Yes, but the base is so small. It doesn't matter if you grow very fast. That does not create too many trading opportunities.
Thank you. Carlos, you want to add a footnote?
Oh, yes. Just Dan mentioned the problem of investment here many times. And we have been discussing with the Brazilian government for years and years to have a model of a contract with other countries. And finally, we got it a year ago. So this is moving. It's moving, and with the Latin American, South American countries, they're moving very well in both directions. So they are accepting also the model of the Brazilian investment contract.
Wonderful news. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Well, we open to the floor, but please, I ask you to ask questions, not to show your homework. We know that you're all knowledgeable on the subject, that you have moral, historical, technological explanations about everything that was discussed here. But please, here is a question and answer moment, not a lecture. So be concise and ask questions. I will leave my friends here at the panel free to answer to you. But please, otherwise we're not giving the opportunity to lots of people to speak. And I think what's interesting is to receive lots of questions. So, who wants to start? Please. Eloy. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's a question for Dan Hamilton. You raised many issues, but 3 of them were related to the investment as a driver, not trade. Second, the matter of jobs and growth is a second point. And in your first intervention, you talk about energy as an important issue related to the Atlantic Basin. So my question is, can you expound, can you detail which is the interrelation or the connection between these 3 issues related to energy, jobs creation and investments in the Atlantic Basin? Thank you.
What we do, should we collect a few questions here? So, another question?
Good morning. My name is Rafael Almeida, and I'd like to know if we are going through a moment of redefining alliances in the South Atlantic, especially relations to Brazil and Africa. And the second question would be, how can we take advantage of collecting more investments in the middle of, or as Simonson pointed out yesterday, of a trade war between Brazil and US and China? How can we take advantage? Do we have a strategy to bring investments from either sides, the Chinese and the Americans?
Okay. Anna? You're very far.
Yeah, it's about the optimist and pessimist about the EU-Mercosur agreement. I want to ask you about the possible scenarios in the two possibilities. If the agreement is not achieved, which is the scenario after that? We will continue with a non-ending negotiation, or that could have some consequences even in the internal Mercosur cohesion. And in the opposite scenario, that the agreement is achieved, which are the consequences, and not only for the trade between Mercosur and the EU, that yesterday the ambassador said that this was wonderful consequences, but on the other actors in the Atlantic, for example, USA, because it will be the first time that the EU will sign an agreement with Latin America before the USA, and other actors like China, which could be the consequence.
Another question? Christian.
Yeah, yes, I would like to ask a question to Carlos about I thought you said investor dispute settlement? Is that what you said last year? You had
It's a format.
A format. Maybe you could give me...
format, because different countries, Brazil was always rejecting all the information. So they developed a model here and offered to the other countries in South America. And they accepted it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Where do I find the framework?
A new life.
Okay.
I hope.
Okay.
Thank you. My question is for Dan. I wanted to get your sense of how far does disaffection in the U.S. and the Congress with Trump's trade policy fall? And specifically, do you see that there's any sense of a fight coming in Congress over the re-ratification of Trade Promotion Authority?
The gentleman. Yeah, let's do, yes. Let us stop now. Alicia, let us stop here, and we'll do a round, and then we start over again. Yeah. Well, there were specific questions to Dan, and more general questions. So, should I propose that first my colleagues here address the general questions, and then Dan addresses his specific questions? Who wants to start?
Yeah, let me address the issue of investment attraction. There has been a debate for a long time in this country with regard to signing investment protection agreements or not. After a few decades, we do have 6 or 7 investment protection agreements with a few African countries, but still. Yes, yeah. In years of fight with OECD not to accept their model. But having said that, at least in this economy in Brazil, it's right now it's hard to think of in terms of real concern in attracting investment, because we are receiving 60+ billion US dollars a year. Of course, the point is good deal of it is merger and acquisition, not greenfield, and a good deal of it is on non-tradables. So this raises an issue in itself. But having said that, you do have right now an institution, Apex, who is the one that you would address potential investors to look for and see what's going on. And I take another footnote to make a small merchandising.
That's excellent.
In the sense that we at Ministry of Planning, together with the Inter-American Bank and Apex, organized last year Brazil Investment Forum, which we are an experience that we are renewing this year in May, in 29th and 30th of May in São Paulo. It's meant for global CEOs. Last year we had 1,500 people. This year we are aiming at twice as much, and a number of business opportunities are raised in this type of exercise. So these are the mechanisms that we have in order to attract and orient a little bit investment. Having said that, we envy the US, the UK, Australia, Germany, and so on, because they have the faculty of saying, not here for a foreign investor. You cannot buy this sport. You cannot buy Qualcomm. You cannot do that. We in Brazil do not have the means to do that, except for CADE, which is the institution that forbids monopolistic behavior. It's an institution of the Ministry of Justice that deals with providing competition in every market. So if there is a non-competitive behavior, then you can forbid. But that's the only tool we have right now, and this is an increasing concern in Brasilia that something has to be at least think of.
Thank you very much. I must say that Renato hasn't paid me anything, but Invest Brazil is a great success. What I heard from everybody last year was a smashing success, and I hope that this year will be the same. It looks like that. Yeah. And now I'm waiting for that wonderful fish that your wife cooks when I go to Brasilia, please. Pirarucu is an Amazon fish, outstanding. Well, a footnote.
A small footnote on what Renato just said. Yes, and then I'll address one of the questions. There is an interesting case, Renato, of the Brazilian government interfering in foreign investment in a particular firm. Probably many of you heard about the negotiations for Boeing to buy Embraer airplane manufacturing. Well, apparently, you are in government, you can confirm or not, but apparently the Brazilian government is excluding the military division of Embraer. So if negotiations between Embraer and Boeing proceed, they will not buy these division. Then I would like to just to provoke all of you, because Brazilians tend to say that this difficulty, these 20 years of negotiations with the European Union, this is due to the fact that Mercosur is negotiating with the European Union. Well, some people believe that we could proceed ourselves. So Brazil, European Union; Argentina, European Union; Uruguay, European Union; Paraguay. I don't buy it, because I guess the Argentinians and the Uruguayans are not disturbing very much these negotiations. I guess the culprit are European Union and ourselves. The resolution of the Mercosur Council was never published in Brazil, so it's not official law. It's not a law. So technically and legally, this does not preclude us from negotiating directly with the European Union. This, of course, would set a big precedent and would kill Mercosur or whatever remains of Mercosur. And but just a point to complicate your thoughts about the subject.
Add a footnote to my footnote. I said there's no mechanism. We have constitutional constraints for foreign investors in some areas, airlines, the press, and the banking sector. It has to be formally approved. In the case of banking sector, it has to be authorized by the president himself, and a few other steps. In the case, yes, and just yesterday, the lower chamber has voted a new system. The case of Embraer is a bit different because the government has the golden share, and hence it's one of the partners involved in the whole negotiation. And of course, Embraer has the military branch and other issues involved.
Issue of, let's say, national security, like Mr. Trump's tariffs. Carlos, you would like to?
We should remind in South America, we had been the just to say in português, quando é que começou Alca aqui dentro o interno das Américas, América Latina, sim, não é o nome Allies. We have I don't know how to define this integration that started much earlier than Mercosur. They have the bases in Montevideo, and maybe 25 years had already passed. So all the original, I don't know that there are any exception, all the original agreements between all the 16 countries in South America, in South America, or 16 countries, have already reached tariff zero. Nobody talks about that because so this is a improvement in the Brazilian commerce here, in South America, and the Colombians having very positive behavior, and Chile, everybody knows. The only black cat is one called Venezuela. But we have this, and is not that's something sizable already. And for this type of operation, the Mercosur is not needed. So they have individual following the Allied system.
So I had two questions directed to me, but there was general, and I think Anna in particular, so the implications of the United States. So let me just on that. I think on investment, it was interesting to hear, if I could provoke my Brazilian colleagues, I think the problem with investment flows in Brazil is not that you don't have a law stopping them, it's that all the rules governing them make it hard for investors. So there might be a lot of investment, but there could be so much more if investment was made the topic to provide it easier for investors to come here. If you couple that with a law that prohibits concerns because of national security, then that's an issue. We have a process in the United States, CFIUS process, that does that. That's why the Qualcomm deal was stopped about China. Europeans don't have anything like that, but they're debating it. It's just, is it country by country, or do you have some sort of EU system? There's a discussion of it. I don't know how practically it would work, frankly. So they still have some work to do on that front too. On the EU Mercosur, we're having a summit, Americas, coming up. Our president says he's coming. So stay tuned about what the U.S. reaction will be. because that'll be, I think, slightly after this might be. I'm not sure the exact timing of it. So I think that comes just after your deadline. So let's see. I can't, no one can predict this. So we'll see. But on the questions, so the debate in the United States, which I come back to. So again, I'm not sure how people follow this. So under the U.S. Constitution, trade authority is lodged with the U.S. Congress, not with the President. So what the Congress has done in the last few decades is delegate that trade promotion authority, they call it, to the executive branch to negotiate trade deals, and then the executive branch comes back to the Congress with the deal and says, take it or leave it, yes or no. Otherwise, the Congress would be in charge, and you can imagine there'd be 500 amendments to any possible deal, and so this is not proven to be workable, and that's why we have this. But it comes up every few years, so and it's coming up again now. So the Trump administration has just applied to the Congress for, again, a delegation of trade promotion authority before June this year. So it puts the Congress in a considerable position on how to monitor the Trump administration's trade policy right now, and there will be lots of debates now in the Congress about this issue over the next few months, and that's where you'll see these divisions come out, and a lot of congressional opposition to some of the aspects of what the Trump administration is doing. So it comes back to my point. I can't predict it, but this is an election year, and it affects different coalitions differently then. For a member of Congress, the entire U.S. House of Representatives is being reelected in November, and a third of the U.S. Senate. And because of the gerrymandering that happens in the United States, many of those seats are quite safe if you make it to the election. If you're in a Republican district and you are the Republican candidate, you're probably going to be reelected. So what happens is that the primaries in the United States, what's happening starting now, become actually where the real debate happens. So you interact the Trade Promotion Authority debate with our primary calendar. It's at the same time. So people will play their constituencies. And it's very hard to predict, but if you just saw what happened, just to give you an example, in the steel country of Pennsylvania, the day there was a special election was the day the president announced the steel tariffs. This is not coincidence, because this is Republican steel country and a Republican candidate, and that candidate lost to a Democrat. This is a big, big thing for thinking ahead about U.S. policy on trade and other things. So in the middle of steel country, the day he announced the tariffs, his candidate lost for the first time in a long, long time. And we've seen that in a number of other by-elections where the Democrat and very heavy Republican territories won. So we'll see. My point is only that there's a really big debate. The president's popularity is down here. And whether that translates into seat-by-seat elections, I can't really predict that. But I think there is more of a debate on trade, and there'll be many more tweaks to the U.S. policies than one might get from the president's tweets. Eloy asked this question about intersection between investment, jobs, and trade, and energy. And actually, you're the expert on this, so I defer to you, actually. Eloy was the co-editor of the book that we produced on energy, so I defer to you on that. But I'm trying to sort of, what is the connection here? I would just start again with the energy point. It's affected by price, and the prices right now don't sort of underscore the most ambitious scenario we have been putting forth for a few years. But nevertheless, you could argue, and I think we try to argue, that if you look at all sorts of kinds of energy today, renewables, biofuels, even fossil fuels, the center of innovation, the center of gravity on the margin is becoming the Atlantic Basin. Not the Middle East, not Russia, but the Atlantic Basin. If you go all the way down through from the Gulf, from Canada, down through the Gulf, down to Brazil and over to West Africa and up, you see all sorts of new types of energy sources either coming online or given price issues again, potentially coming online. You couple that with the biofuels giant of Brazil. The only other real biofuels country in the world is the United States, I think. The biggest flow of energy from Brazil to the EU is biofuels. You can just go down the line. And you couple that with the revolution in energy that's happening in the United States in terms of all sorts of kinds of energy, in which the U.S. is now not only importing but also exporting certain kinds of energy. It is changing the dynamics everywhere, really, and will continue. And if prices change, it'll even be more so. But at the moment, this is the underlying fundamental that's developing. And it's not really being discussed or understood, really. So I just say that. And I think that translates then into the investment implications. Again, based on price, you could see new kinds of investment flowing in different areas because of the energy economy that's developing. You see a lot of actually European investment in the United States. If you go to Texas, European investment in Texas is amazing right now, and because of the energy economy. And you see, because of the U.S. ability now to export liquefied natural gas to Europe, it has forced the Russians to lower the price. And they're building new types of terminals in different European ports because they want to break their dependence on Russian energy. But that's going to start to develop everywhere. And that's just sort of the beginning. The time frame is a long one. It's not tomorrow, but it is a dynamic, and it will influence energy investments as well, which of course then turn into jobs, seems to me. If this does develop the way I'm trying to portray it, you will see all sorts of new types of job opportunities in many different parts of the energy sector. And we see that tremendously in the United States, in areas that haven't been traditionally part of the energy economy. And I just example with that, not trying to be parochial, but that was the question. If you go to North Dakota, the western part of North Dakota has been the center of the fracking revolution, and it's went down. It was boom and bust. It goes up and down, but it has transformed that state's economy in ways you can't even imagine. For instance, the state legislature has created a scholarship fund. Anybody born in North Dakota can go to college for free now in North Dakota, because they're not going to college. They're going to the man camps in western North Dakota to work in the energy economy. A McDonald's job in that part of the state, it pays $20 an hour. That's just the McDonald's. You can imagine what they're getting paid if they actually work in the economy. So this is transforming a lot of state economies in ways that wouldn't think about, and not just Texas. So I think it bears watching. We have a whole book on that. We have a number of books on the topic, but your latest book talks about energy and transportation in the Atlantic Basin, and I think underpins a lot of that. And I think it's worth a read.
Thank you very much, Dan, for conveying the American enthusiasm, which is always welcome. We start late, but we stop in time. I apologize if there were a few more questions, but we have many things to do. I would like to ask a final if there are extra footnotes to be added, or all the writers are happy? No more footnotes? So I would like to thank very much my colleagues and friends here at the round table. I would invite you to a warm applause for that. Thank you very much. I have a few words to say to my people, to our people. First, people in the steering committee, so people in the project, you will follow us to another place where we'll have a very short meal, and then we have the steering committee. Now, authors, speakers in the seminar. As you all know, we are going to publish a book on the seminar. So, two pledges. if you want to have your paper in the book, send it to us until May 25. So I'm being very generous. I'm giving you 2 months. If you have already the papers, send them, because this eases our work, because the papers will go to a refereeing process. So if I have already 2 or 3 papers, I start the refereeing process. You are helping us, okay? But the deadline, but this is the Prussian deadline. Dan knows quite well the German, so maybe I should speak in Deutsch. So a Prussian deadline is May 25. After May 25, I don't receive papers anymore. Second, nearly all the papers yesterday, which of course were by definition outstanding, but most of them had the 2 world view, forgetting the Atlantic. Please focus. The raw material is there. I think everything is there, but just make a shift in your paper and emphasize, discuss more the Atlantic side of your points, of your presentations. Please, because this is Brussels is paying us for a project on the Atlantic, and I had wonderful presentations, but 70% in the average of them were about global issues. Okay, global issues, but then you come down to the Atlantic, make an effort. My feeling is that the material is there. The rough stone is there. To become a diamond is in 1 month of work you get there. So please, let us make a wonderful book out of this seminar. This is going to be the 2nd book. These books are edited by Brookings. Then we give the work to Johns Hopkins. Dan is here, is a witness. And please, we have already a first very, very nice book out of the energy theme. So please, let us do a 2nd wonderful book. Yes, Francine.
And as soon as the papers are sent and revised, we will publish the papers on our website for free access, on the Monnet Network website. So if you like to access the others, the pages, the knowledge.
Everything will be in the project website. Your wonderful photos, everything, and I think the whole seminar also. Okay, the video. Thank you very much.